Hello, everyone. Welcome to this MethodsNET webinar series. My name is Silvia Fierascu. I'm very happy to host you today for a short session of applied social network analysis. I called this session Co-Creating the Future, and it sounds very futuristic and very daring and very ambitious because it is. What I would like to talk to you about today would be how to use your research in order to actually effect change in the world. I'm a firm believer that whatever we learn in our PhDs, in our postdoc years, is very, very valuable information that the world actually needs. And my role today, and also during the summer school course, the week-long summer school course that I will teach, will be to show you how to use this research in order to work with different types of stakeholders to change something in the world. Social network analysis, what is it? We will talk today about different examples of network perspectives that matter. We will talk very briefly about what network analysis is and when is it useful. And then we will go through two different steps as well. How do we collect network data and how do we work with network data? And if we have time, we will go to an applied exercise, and that's optional, the network game. And I'm not sure that we will record that, but we'll see how everybody feels at the end. So this is the plan for today. At the end of the presentation, we will have a Q&A, and I encourage you to ask all sorts of questions there. All right. So what is network analysis and why is it helpful? To put a visual picture to it, a visual understanding to it, social network analysis is really trying to map ecosystems where different players are nodes, and the interactions between those nodes are the edges or what we are going to measure as well in order to visualize and understand that particular ecosystem. In our case, the nodes can be people, organizations, countries, concepts, documents, almost anything can be a node. The interactions, however, is where things become very interesting. How do we map and how do we decide what an interaction is? Depends very much on what's the objective with our research. So it can be, for example, friendship relationships. It can be communication ties. They can be contracts. They can be, I don't know, kinship ties, and so on and so forth. So once we identify the nodes and the edges for our ecosystem, we go ahead and visualize it with the help of a computer software. And then with the help of network analysis, we are able to systematically uncover patterns within those particular ecosystems. So for example, we can look at an ecosystem and say, is it fragmented or not? Is it centralized? We can identify different key nodes that play very interesting roles, for example, the hubs or very popular individuals or organizations, bridging ones, connectors within the ecosystem, nodes that connect otherwise unconnected parts of the system. We can identify influential individuals or organizations. We can identify communities, and we can see other different patterns as well, like chains or star configurations or very cohesive configurations, or even to identify nodes at risk or nodes that are isolated from the rest of the ecosystem. But why would we want to do this? Why would we want to map an ecosystem, look for these interactions, understand how they are connected? Personally, I use network analysis in a variety of contexts. Most often than not, I use it for change management. So, for example, I work with different organizations, be them, business organizations or civil society organizations or public administrations that go through changes, for example, digital transformation or mergers and acquisitions or culture change, or they want their community to become more resilient. And we are using network analysis to map the ecosystem of players, the people involved in the organization or the community, identify the key people, the most well-connected, the most important people in that ecosystem. And then we work together with them in order to co-create the change that we want. So for example, if we want to do culture change, we would identify the key formal and informal influencers or people who have influence within the organization. And together with them, we would create different workshops and and decide together what would be the strategy to change the culture. Or if we are doing a network analysis within a community that we want it to become more resilient, then we would understand what are the, let's say, organizations that are part of that particular ecosystem. How do they collaborate together? Once we have that network mapped, we're going to identify the key organizations with which we can co-create the future of that particular community. So change management, ecosystem development, anything that has to do with social resilience and anti-fragility. So for example, if we look at an ecosystem that is fragmented, how are we going to connect the different components together? Or how are we going to include or develop certain policies that would inbuilt mechanisms of learning between the different nodes within the ecosystem? So how do we create these virtuous circles of or feedback loops of iteration, information sharing, knowledge sharing, and so on, so that the community can learn from itself, so to say. We also look at, for example, why is it that certain organizations or communities do not innovate? And most often than not, these problems have something to do with, let's say, the silo-ness of the particular ecosystem. So for example, when we talk about diversity, inclusion, and equity, we also look at the potential or the existence of homogeneity within those groups, within those components. And then we start creating strategies in order to bridge, in order to be more inclusive, in order to transfer information and knowledge from one side to the other so that we create new synergies. Most often than not, what we actually map are communication ties, information flows, and some sort of trust. For example, whether that, we can think about that in terms of trust, in terms of collaborations, or in terms of partnerships, or in terms of financial contracts. Those are some form of trust that we are looking at. And if we are able to map and systematize this information and co-create together with these stakeholders what the next step of the development of that community would be, then, that becomes very rewarding for a researcher. That becomes very rewarding. So let me give you, in the next few minutes, a few examples from my own research that I think are very interesting to look at, and will allow us to look at, the world perhaps through the lens of networks. So during my PhD, I became very interested in state capture, in institutionalized corruption. I come from Romania, and reaching now from Timișoara, and that is, the most western part of Romania. And I always had, but I was living in Hungary, doing my PhD at CEU, and I was living in a country that was where, political corruption was, or political state capture was very strong, and all the theory was telling us that it's actually business capture that is more important. So I had this empirical cognitive dissonance that I wanted to look at. So I was I was thinking, let's take a look at the financial transactions between public institutions and private organizations. Those are the public procurement contracts. Public procurement is, more than 15% globally of GDP. So we spend a lot of money on that. And it's also a very prone area for corruption. Moreover, I was coming from Romania, a country where corruption is an endemic problem. And I was finding in the literature that despite all the money that has been invested into anti-corruption efforts, the level of corruption has not systematically gone down. And there's absolutely no example of a country in the world where corruption as an endemic problem would become corruption as an exception problem after, investing different types of money and effort into anti-corruption. So for me, that was a very interesting, puzzling situation. So I started looking at, I mapped 28 countries over a period of 10 years, more than 10 million public procurement contracts. And what I want to show you here are basically 4 different typical network configurations, network ecosystems, that tell different stories about corruption in those countries. And I think it will become very apparent for you how we can do different strategies of anti-corruption based on these network approaches. So I built the network connecting the nodes, public institutions, to the companies that won public procurement contracts. And using the corruption risk index developed by Mishi Fazekas and their co-authors, I was able to put a color, or let's say a number on that contract of how likely it was to be a high corruption risk or low corruption risk. This is the Netherlands, where you see the nodes are very intentionally made very, very small. And because the focus is on the edges, on how the edges are distributed within the network. So what you see here is the fact that corruption is centralized around a particular key actor. If you are an anti-corruption agency, you are able to intervene very strategically and targeted in this kind of an ecosystem, investigate the most important player, and then you basically disrupt a principal component. Here's the example of the UK. You see the patterns are a bit different. You have a lot of star configurations that are connected to one another. So here the strategy would be divide and conquer. So if you are an anti-corruption agency, you would first go for the most popular organizations, the ones that have the star configurations the largest. And then you would go for the intermediary ones, the ones that connect the different components together. Now, here is the example of Hungary. In Hungary, you have basically two different worlds. You have the high corruption risk island and the low corruption risk island. If you are an anti-corruption agency, you can intervene to curb corruption in Hungary, with much more ease as opposed to other countries, because you have the two island, like the high corruption risk island pretty much on its own. And then you can also use the examples of good practice in order to promote the desired type of behaviors that you want. Now here is the case of Romania, the hairball, as we call it. You see here, there's a lot of discretionary power in terms of contracting. So sometimes organizations contract clean, other times they contract high corruption risk. So if you're interested in what is a resilient ecosystem, the Romanian case of public procurement is a resilient ecosystem. But one thing that I want to attract your attention to are the numbers that we're looking at. For example, the proportions of high and low corruption risk that you see here. As you see, for all these different countries, they are more or less similar, these kinds of proportions of high corruption risk and low corruption risk procurement, right? Which is to say that looking only at the aggregate numbers, trying to understand this phenomenon from a purely statistical point of view will not give us the story of how to intervene effectively into these countries. The networks will tell us what would be the most important, effective strategies to curb corruption. And let me divert back to Romania. So in Romania, more than 80%, basically 86% of investigations in high-level corruption start from whistleblowers. Now, whistleblowers are a very subjective data collection method. And network theory tells us that when you have a complex network going about, asking individuals to portray the structure of a complex network will mostly be impossible to do. So even if Romania has and is one of the most successful countries in the world in anti-corruption, because based on the numbers of proportion of politicians, high-level politicians and business people it put to jail, it put behind bars on charges of corruption, it does great. The level of systematic corruption in Romania has not gone down because these complex corruption machines continue to go, right? So what happens is that the anti-corruption agency starts to intervene randomly in these complex networks without being able to create big damage to them. So in order to do effective damage or to destructure these ecosystems, one would have to go much more systematic and strategic about it. And here is where I proposed to the Romanian Competition Council, for example, that their strategy of interventions in cases of corruption would be reversed. So first you would use objective data to map the entire ecosystem to understand the complexity and where the interdependencies lie. And then to use network analysis in order to structure that information. How fragmented or centralized is the network? How much overlap you have? What is the size of the largest connected component? Which are the key players? What are the communities inside, and how are they connected? And then using this to create intervention scenarios. So with this methodology, you can actually test empirically what would, in a research manner, what would happen if you intervene in certain areas of the network, and how would you be able to dismantle that? But altogether, that gives us a much better measurement of corruption machines than perhaps the individual subjective ones would do. So this was the example from looking at large ecosystems using public data and trying to create some effective change in the world. The cooperation between the research side and the institutional side, which meant even training investigators into how to use in their big data platform network data, network indicators, data visualization, how to use econometric together with other types of evidence, including qualitative evidence and so on. That was part of the process as well. So now Romania does have a process for targeting corruption in a much structured way than it did before, and I am very happy that I could contribute to that. Now let's switch to a different kind of example. This one is about culture in a very broad sense. So Timișoara, the city where I am, is very well known because the Romanian Revolution started here in 1989. It was the first free and democratic city of Romania. It's also well known because it was the first, city in Europe to use electric lights and to have trams and things like that. So basically, the city has this identity of being an innovation city. Now, in 2023, Timișoara was the European capital, one of the European capitals of culture. And this was a very long journey for the city. So basically they started a team who started working on this concept of becoming a European capital of culture back in 2010. If you can imagine, in 2016, they won the bid to become a European capital of culture. And it was supposed to happen in 2021. But because of the pandemic and all of that, they had to postpone to 2023. So in 2023, the mayor's office hired me and my team to do an analysis of the evolution of partnerships around the title of the European Capital of Culture from 2017 to 2024. So they provided access to the entire database. I was working with the Center for Projects, which is a new institution that was formed under the mayor's office, the main coordinator after 2021 of the Capital of Culture bid cultural program, and the main financing institution for this. So what this meant was that I had to analyze all the contract data that came around the European Capital of Culture between 2017 and 2024. Why the contract? So I proposed to them that if we want to understand, basically they hired me to do an impact assessment of the program from the institutional point of view, looking at all the data that they had, right? So one of the impact evaluation that I proposed was to be the impact on the ecosystem of culture itself, looking therefore at partnerships between the different organizations. So what I would like to show you in this picture is the evolution year by year of the network of partnerships, the network of collaboration of organizations involved or being, who were financed and being involved in implementing cultural programs in Timișoara, cultural projects in Timișoara. Altogether, that was more than 1,000 organizations, more than 3,000 events, cultural events that have been implemented, more than 340 locations within the city where cultural events happened in a myriad of formats and cultural artistic expressions, from, I don't know, big concerts to workshops with children, people with disabilities, and so on and so forth. And Timișoara, among others, it also won prizes for being an example of good practice in terms of accessibility to cultural events, in terms of inclusion. And altogether, in looking also at what other European capitals of culture have done, Timișoara is a great example of mobilization bottom up of the civil society and basically organizations from across the spectrum. So let me show you what the network analysis revealed. So I remind you here that a node is an organization. A link is a partnership contract signed between those two organizations that received money in order to implement cultural programs in Timișoara, cultural projects in Timișoara. That was 2017, 2018, 2019, 2020, 2021, 2022, 2023, 2024. Now, network analysis. So let me just tell you that besides all the data analysis, the standard statistical, typical data analysis that we've done on all the data that was collected by this institution over time, we also had this network analysis. We had interviews with the key identified players within the ecosystem, more than 40 interviews, more than 6 focus groups. We also had a participatory planning session with people, representatives from the mayor's office from different directions, in order to build a legacy plan. And finally, we had a public consultation with actors from the cultural sector. So we used all this insight, all this input from all the different types of methods, the data collection and data analysis, in order to understand what was the legacy of the 2023 year, and what should continue. So this ended up being a document is called the Legacy Plan for the period 2024 to 2028 that shapes the way funding is being done in Timișoara for the cultural sector. And that lays the foundation for the next cultural strategy for the city for the next 10 years. So what the network analysis shows is basically the development of the ecosystem in 2 phases. The first phase, 2017 to 2020, you can see it's very, very centralized around a certain key actor. In this case, Association Timișoara 2023, which was the main coordinator of the program. Now, typically, having such a centralized network is important in order to signal leadership, let's say, when you start a new program. So people need to know, need to associate a new initiative, especially if it's, a broad one, an ambitious one, with something. So that served the purpose. However, a very centralized network structure is also very vulnerable, right? If something happens to that particular organization, then there's no cohesion within the ecosystem so that the other players could continue to build together things in order to have that particular community being resilient. If funds are being funneled through this particular central organization, it can many times act as a bottleneck on, let's say, innovation or on synergies within the particular ecosystem. So in 2021, when the Center for Projects was basically set up, it took over the coordination of the cultural program, and it changed the strategy for empowering the bottom-up ecosystem in order to create these, as you can see now, different hubs emerging within the ecosystem that were organizations that started collaborating much more between them in order to implement cultural programs. Now, the 2021-2022 new hubs that arrived, of course, they were organizations that have had a long history in Timișoara and that formed the backbone for 2023. They mobilized a lot of the partnerships that happened in 2023. But what is very, very interesting to see is that the mechanisms of generating partnerships within the cultural sector after 2023, after the money was cut, basically remained to be this collaborative transfer of trust type of mechanism instead of actually being preferential attachment or this mono leadership at the community level. So what we are hoping, obviously, 1 year to look at the effects is not enough, but we will continue to do so. However, to look at the projections in 2025 and 2026 and so on. But what is very, very interesting to say here is that the network allowed us to identify the mechanisms which can be now inbuilt into the legacy plan and the cultural strategy in order to make this culture ecosystem in Timișoara resilient. What does that mean? Well, if there are shocks to it, if you take out the funds, if you take out a few key organizations, will the actors find each other and be able to coordinate and partner together in order to implement innovative and interesting projects? Will the ecosystem continue to be inclusive and diverse enough in order to create, innovation and other things like that? And I'm happy that an approach like this can help actually in framing different policy mechanisms and instruments in order to effect long-lasting, sustainable change within a broader ecosystem. All right, so this was my second example. Now I will go to a third example, which is from organizations. But you can think about this at the organization level, or you can also think about it at the community level. And what I started the presentation telling you that we can apply these within organizations themselves, right? That want to effect change. So for culture change in particular, I think this approach is extremely important. Why? Because I want to show you what it means in the network to have central players with whom you can actually effect change. So imagine that this is the network of an organization where you have on the left-hand side in the formal leadership, you have highlighted the top management of an organization, where they are placed within the trust network of that organization. So here, the nodes are people, and the connections between them are different types of interactions that signal trust. Who do you trust? Who do you communicate most with within that organization? And you can see the top management being placed somewhere in the network. Now, what you see on the other side are what we call the influencers, but I think this is a very generic term. It's the actors, the people that are best placed, the most central in this particular organization. They were nominated by their peers to be the people who are most talked to, and people come for them for advice, and generally people regard them and acknowledge them as some informal leaders within the organization. I'm forcing a little bit the informal leadership because many of these people who are very central in organizations are not necessarily aware that they are informal leaders, right? That they are opinion leaders or something like that. So an exercise like this is actually an intervention into the culture of an organization. Now, here's what network theory tells us and shows us about the influence and the impact of these people in organizations. 1 step away, 2 steps away. So through trust ties, people who are very central in these trust networks are able to reach much broadly within the organization. And that, that's same actually within communities as well. So through very strong connections and trust-based connections, these people can actually reach many people within the organization, which takes us back to how change management is usually done. Change management is usually done top down, so you get a directive from the top management saying that from tomorrow we're going to do things differently. Of course, it's better for the organization. Of course, we'll become more performant and effective and so on. But more than 80% of change initiatives fail because people resist change, and they resist change precisely because it comes top down. But with this network approach, the fact that you are able to use the methodology in order to map who trusts whom within the organization, and then work with these people because they know the realities of the organization much better than the top management does, and what how change can happen and should happen within the organization, that empowers change bottom up. The people within the organization become co-creators of the future of the organization themselves, right? And the top management itself changes the way it does things from giving directives, who should this from tomorrow on, to listening and empowering, giving support to the people who can actually effect change. So these principles are the same whether we talk about organizations or communities, let's say urban ecosystems and so on. The difference being that in the case of organizations, you would use tools such as internal communication, workshops, team building, stuff like that in order to, and the timeline is obviously much shorter because you have more incentives and infrastructure at play. Whereas in the public communities, urban communities, unstructured communities, you can use policy instruments, you can use also like public consultations, you can use participatory democracy instruments in order to engage the people into designing, co-designing, and implementing the change they want to see in their communities. All right, so I hope these three were good enough examples to get you interested in why this is an interesting and important approach. Now, why do I think it works? It's not that I think it works. I think research shows that it works on many different levels. It's obviously hard to do in practice. Why? Simply because just imagine culture change within an organization and the larger, broader community. By definition, it requires the leadership to be open to doing things differently. It requires a certain type of democratic culture, to embrace a certain kind of democratic culture, and this trust that co-created and a well-facilitated process of co-creation and co-design and co-creation can lead to better outcomes than if decisions are taken differently. Another reason why network analysis in general works very, very well is because it's not only I think people confuse it, but like reduce its definition to the methodology itself, which is, it is a methodology, but the objectives and the theory and the data and the methods are correlated very, very strong within this worldview or the way of looking at the world, right? So if you look at the objectives, let's say we want more innovation, or we want mobilization, or we want cohesion, we want more collaboration or trust or communication within XYZ different contexts. Those are network concepts. We have theories, very strong theories that tell us a lot about how communication happens, information flows happen within networks, why information travels faster or slower, where does it get blocked, things that, how does that relate to reciprocity, to mutuality, to cohesion and the transfer of trust? What does that create within the organization, within the context? Or, for example, what does it mean to have a connector, an organization that connects otherwise unconnected parts of the ecosystem, from that particular node being able to innovate in a very peculiar, unique way because it has these different perspectives that only it has over the ecosystem, to that being a person, let's say, who is has a lot of tensions to manage because they can be dragged to the right in different smaller groups, and they have to reconcile that information or those processes together. And then because data is the same with the concept itself, right? So what we are collecting is information or data on communication patterns, on collaboration patterns, on what trust means from different points of view, on the products of those interactions, whether it's innovation or I don't know, homogeneity of different kinds, some sort of reinforcement of distinct patterns of behaviors and so on. So yeah, I think, network analysis or social network social networks offer us much more than just methodology. It's a scientific, systematic, reliable, scalable, and organic way of looking at the world, of measuring it, and of changing it. Because, most often than not, the nodes that we are analyzing are either people that are alive or organizations that are working, and all of them, or many of them, are interested actually in working together to get better outcomes. How do we collect data? There are 3 typical ways: interviews, questionnaires, or digital data. The sampling technique is different. So for example, for interviews, you get typically snowball sampling. You start from, let's say, the most important key players you think are in a particular ecosystem. You go and ask them different things about what you want to ask them. One of the questions being, who do you think is the best, in your field, or who do you work best with, or who do you communicate most with, or who inspires you, or who do you think should be interviewed next? Then go to the next person's nominated, and so on and so forth. And this is how you grow the ecosystem that you'll be looking at. One of the problems with this approach is that if the when you do this subjective, it's almost, think about it like the anti-corruption tool that is being used with the whistleblowers in order to detect the larger unseen corruption ecosystem. You might miss certain important parts of the ecosystem if you go through the subjective perceptions of people about who are the most important within an unstructured ecosystem. So with interviews, because you don't have enough time and money and all of that to do it at large scale, it can be, perhaps misleading. However, interviews can be used at the end, let's say after you do an objective mapping of the ecosystem. If you remember from the example, so we would use whistleblower accounts at the end of the process after we mapped it in order to get more qualitative insights into different dynamics and interactions that happen within a particular ecosystem. Then one of the most used are the questionnaires. For example, the questionnaire is what we use usually in organizations. We can have a list of, and we also look for subjective, or we're looking at subjective and perception related questions. However, with this approach, you actually are able to reach the entire workforce. So let's say the whole population within a particular organism, institution, organization, and so on. So that gives you a better, so if everybody gives their own perceptions and you get at some sort of truth about the underlying network on which you can calculate players. Also need to have a representative sample, because otherwise you're going to get lost into different needs of the network without being able to map the entire organization. And then finally, one of my favorites is using digital data, because you are able to do entire populations, because you are able to look for objective data. But obviously, these are not necessarily the best type of data for different research questions. So depending on what you're aiming for, object data could be very, very handy. Open data, such as, public procurement contracts, participation events, who was invited as a speaker to what conference, who talks to whom, how much flows, and other things like that can paint a very interesting picture about the underlying network structure that we can then complement with different other types of information. So what I like about network analysis is that it invites for also mixed methods research designs. You can use, qualitative stuff, and then networks, and then quantitative stuff, or the other way around, or whichever way you want. I think very accommodating framework that allows us to get very complex pictures over dynamics of complex ecosystems. And then, as I said, we're collecting information, of very straightforward information on the concepts we're interested in. So, for example, for communication, you would ask, who do you communicate with most often? Or who do you work with best? Or who inspires you? Who motivates you? Who do you trust with personal information? Who is good at representing the problems of others? Who should know about your initiative and other things like that? So you ask people specific questions on the concept of interest, the mechanism of interest that you have. And then with examples of objective data, you can look at contracts, agreements, memoranda of understanding, financial transactions, in-kind transaction, pro bono services, joint participation in events and projects, and so on. So you can look at different types of collaboration, partnerships, and other data that you want. And there's typically two ways of doing it: active and passive. So active means you're asking directly the actors, and the participants, and passive means you collect data about them. Once you have all this data, you can look at different levels of analysis. You can look at the ecosystem level, you can look at communities, identify communities, you can identify key players, and then you can even look at different network subsets. So for example, let's say in an organization, I want to see who communicates with whom, and then or who trusts whom, and then I want to look at the subset of women versus the subset of men, and try to understand, for example, if there are different power dynamics, collaboration dynamics, or anything like that. If I have a suspicion that or I have a research question that is gendered in some way, or I can section the networks, look at what are the collaboration patterns of the management versus non-management, or how does the organization change if I take out the management from the equation. And I have a lot of interesting stories about and cases where I had a lot to learn from these kinds of exercises, where you can also do resilience tests on the net out certain kinds of players. Just to play on reality or the case, real world implications of kinds of exercises. And what do network patterns tell us? Well, in terms of the network structure, we can have three different types of network structures. And I will start with the small world. These are, if you think about something in the real world, the small world, I think Facebook is a good example of that, or maybe LinkedIn, but Facebook for sure, right? Because you have these communities communicate a lot one with another, like your close friends and so on. But you also have within those networks players that connect to other groups. So therefore they shrink the distances between us. Now, the mechanism at work in these kinds of small world networks, it's called transfer trust, or transitivity, or cohesion. There are, let's say, opportunities and constraints in small world. An opportunity is the fact that the world just becomes smaller. You are able to reach distant groups through people that intermediate between those groups. On the other hand, you can also create really close communities, like, let's say like this one, which are great for familiarity and support and things like that, who, however, can create themselves echo chambers within the network, so they can trap information within the same community instead of spreading it wide through the entire network. It can create polarization in certain circumstances. It can reinforce different biases and so on. So obviously, when we speak about real-world networks, we're always thinking about what kinds of different mechanisms we use in order to create balance between closed networks and open networks. So the situations in which these bridging nodes are. Then you have scale-free networks. And if you think about a typical scale-free network, Twitter or X is a good example of that, where they're called scale-free because they have the same recurrent patterns, different scales or different levels. What is very typical for these kinds of networks are the appearance of hubs or nodes that have disproportionately more links and more connections than the rest of the network. And the mechanism at play here is preferential attachment. So if you think about, let's say the internet is also a scale-free network. If you create a website, in order to gain visibility, you would want to index it to Google. Now, Google is a hub that gains more power by the fact that new coming nodes to the network attached to it index it. On the other hand, the reason we do that is because we need and we want the visibility that Google itself and not other player can for us, right? So scale-free networks, they get us in a situation of a Matthew effect where the rich get richer. There's also a problem of the fact that there's very low cohesion in scale-free networks. So the audience of a particular hub does not communicate, does not interact with one another. That creates dependence on information flows and other things like that with a network. And then finally, there's this core periphery structure that combines the two types of mechanisms, very shortly and generically explained today. The cohesion that creates the core of the network, a stable core of the network, where that is more resilient. So if something happens to on edges or nodes within the core would be able to reshuffle and reconnect in such a way so that it continues to perform its function. And the periphery, which is dependent on the core. There's very cohesion in the periphery. That's what gives us the dependence on the core nodes. And if something happens, they are much more vulnerable. For example, in terms of the interactions to the core nodes. All right, and if we are to think about like a real world example of a core periphery network, I would say the World Trade Network, where you have the global north countries, and especially like Europe. Europe creates this very tightly knit core, and then it has these edges, peripheries, global trade with global south countries that are dependent economically on countries within the core, but the core is pretty stable because it can realign itself if something happens. Right. So these are some of the macro level patterns that we can look at in real cases. And then finally, I would like to talk to you about the different key roles that have within the network. So with analysis, we can identify, as I said, the most central players within the ecosystems. And network theory tells us that there are three core roles that the different nodes can play ecosystem, and you can really think about it in personal terms as well. So all of us play these roles in our lives in different aspects of our lives, whether all three together or each of them in different contexts, we kind of all do. But from what I want you to think about is what happens from those roles, what you can do from those particular roles. So for example, we have popular individuals that have a lot of visibility and attention, that connect otherwise, that connect to attract a lot of attention around them. Have influential people. So to be popular does not necessarily mean you're influential. Influential, you have to be popular, but also connected to other popular people. We call these influential because they have access to the backbone infrastructure of the network, and they can mobilize much better than any other individuals within the network. And then you have the connectors, nodes or individuals that connect between otherwise disconnected or unconnected parts of the network. And the way you can think about connectors is what happens to the ecosystem if you take them out. So if you take them out, you create real damage to the structure of the network. So components the network starts to fragment itself. Now, in terms of the opportunities that these roles offer for individuals or organizations are the following. So for a popular node, individual organization, they can facilitate the access to information that it's much more difficult to do from other key roles. So they can include more people, more actors within the ecosystem, information flows. For influential individuals or organizations, they can mobilize resources much better because they have access to the entire infrastructure, and they can do this cohesion or through this transfer of trust within the network, and therefore they can mobilize much easier than other individuals. And then finally, the connectors can enable innovation by the fact that they see what happens to the left and what happens to the right, and they have the agency, if they're aware of it, to bring together this information in perhaps a novel way, or to just facilitate other people coming together or other organizations coming together doing things. Now, if you think about your own lives, I'm pretty sure that professionally, at least, we are playing on these roles a lot of times. All right, so of course, this is just a preview. I would really love to go into the details of everything, but what I'd like you to take away today is that analysis is, or applied social network analysis, is a way to visualize and understand the world. It's a very intuitive perspective on how things happen, simply because most of the concepts that we are interested in, social scientists, are inherently network concepts like power, influence, communication, collaboration, trust. All of these are network concepts, and we can measure them. We have theories that talk to them and help us to understand, and we have a lot of data at our disposal that we can collect and look at. It has actionable insights. So this, learning this methodology doesn't only allow you to build a beautiful, thought-provoking PhD thesis or research article, but it allows you to actually collaborate with real actors in order to effect change. And I've been doing this for 15 years, and I absolutely adore and love this part of my job, with all the complications that an approach like this can bring. It's a scientific, reliable, and scalable methodology. It works well with high-tech AI, I don't know, large language, I don't know, like anything. You can bring in qualitative in order to enhance whatever we learn from the network perspective. I love that it makes the invisible visible. I think one of the most interesting things about this approach is that it allows you to refute, I think, and reject a lot of the intuitions that we previously had about different ecosystems with, or let's say, objective data, or even large-scale subjective data. And then, yes, it is a methodology for change. And as social scientists, I think we have never been more relevant in today's society than we are today, not because we have a lot of knowledge that we built upon, but also because we have the new technologies and the openness from different actors to co-create what the future looks like. And I think we should definitely inhabit that intellectual and action space. And if this was a preview, of course, during the summer school class, we will go much more in depth into this over the week. We will learn, how to do network analysis in R, which allows us to go into the inferential network analysis space, where we can do this in point and click open source software. We can talk about very different cases of data collection. And I encourage each of you, if you take this class, to come up with your own to discuss and work on your own research projects during the class. We can talk about different research designs and how mixed methods, ethics, because there's a huge topic around that, different tips, tricks about how to do this well, either for your PhD or in practice. Obviously, we will get back like every time to why are we doing this and how can we do it better. All right, and with this, thank you very much for your time. I hope to see you. And yeah, scan the QR code if you'd like to read more about the class. And I'm looking forward to meeting you soon. In the meantime, I will stop the presentation, and I am all yours for questions and answers. I did not do well with the 20 minutes that I was hoping for, so please do let me know. I will open the Q&A. Jana? Good literature suggestion to learn about the methodology. Absolutely. If you have registered for this webinar, then most likely you will receive not only this presentation, but I can provide a reading list if you're interested. Yeah, I have a book in progress. Hopefully, it will come out by the time we start the class. It's Applied Social Network Analysis for Researchers and Practitioners that I'm co-writing with my longtime teaching assistant, Fierascu Hillman from University of Amsterdam. All right, I see in the chat some questions. I can answer them if there are any. All right. Thank you, Jana, for the question. All right. Leo, I'm happy to see you in the call. Okay, if there are no other questions, I do want to ask whether you have more time to stay over this, and if you want to, thank you, Leo. If you want to do the network game or not, that would basically be a live demonstration of how to do a network analysis, and we're going to use you, the participants, as the nodes. And the connections between you would be your interest in different types of research methods. So, but that will take us probably, I would say maybe 15, 20 minutes. Flavia, let me see. Could you tell us a little more about the difficulties of applying this approach? How does the practitioner react to them? Honestly, practitioners are very much interested in this, simply because, let's say you are a CEO of an organization that has tried to do change within the organization, but has faced a lot of resistance from the workforce. They do come up for this approach because they want to organically do that. So who are the best positioned people within my already workforce who can help me effect change, who can help me co-create, co-design the change initiative so that I get the buy-in from the people within the organization, because without it, it doesn't seem like we're going to move the needle forward. Or if you are, let's say, a mayor's, like a town, like a public municipality, city municipality, for example, and you want to make your city more participatory, you could do this in a one-size-fits-all generic type of interventions and calls to action to the community in order to become more active. Or you can look at whatever synergies and energy and collaborations are already happening, identify the key organizations with whom you can co-create or co-design and co-create and co-implement the plan for making the city more active and more proactive, and that would work better. So, for example, we've done exactly this in Timișoara with culture, with the strategy for smart city and digital transformation, where these efforts have not been top-down directive of, let's say, the public administration. They have been co-created, like, how do you say, when you take responsibility, like if you participate in the process, you own the process as well. So the actors themselves have been much more involved in applying the strategy and so on. Next week, we're going to start a similar process on the open data at the city level. We are going to invite the quadruple helix organizations from the public administration, academia, business, and civil society to co-create. Well, first of all, do a needs assessment at the level of the stakeholders, and then co-create and co-design the process of how the community would work together in Timișoara for the next year, and then envision how that will happen in the next 5 years. And then together strategically with these actors, we will mobilize and create different initiatives. So thank you, Flavia. I hope I answered. If you ask a question, how do you trust an organization to research subjects? Is the answer of one question valid enough to examine the trust network in the organization? How do you increase the validity of the answers? That's a very good question. So this is always, I think, this has to be, what you're asking really is, how do you define the edge that you're interested in? Yeah, the interaction that you're interested in. So if the interaction of essence here is trust between different organizations, you need to identify conceptually and data-wise, what does that mean? If you define it, and how does trust mean between different organizations, it might be too generic. But if you ask what are the good indicators that two organizations trust each other, the answer to that could be, let's say, they sign contracts, they exchange money between each other, they collaborate in different contexts, and so on. So you always have to have a very clear picture of how do you measure the interaction of interest. And this is definitely something that we need to discuss with each participant, for example, in the class. What does that mean in the context of their research? Let me give you an example from the culture part, where I did have some pushback when I was talking to people about why is it that I consider trust the level of partnerships, formal partnerships, so agreements signed between different organizations, when they said, a lot of this happens informally. And to me, the answer was, first of all, the contract data is just one layer of data that we are going to collect about trust. We also had the interviews and the focus groups where we drilled down into what trust means. But I wanted us to have, because this was the purpose of the analysis, was to understand what is the legacy of a program and what is the impact of a program, what are the things that we want to keep investing in long-term in Timișoara, so that the community, the culture sector, becomes resilient, sustainable, even with little money and so on, right? So the purpose was really to institutionalize what trust means, or collaboration and co-creation and participation together in culture. So I argued that looking at contract data as the backbone of institutionalization of trust between different organizations, because these are formal documents that create histories for the organizations. People come and go from these organizations. Even if, some people were fundamental to create a certain tie, a certain agreement within the organization, that agreement formalized the connection at the level of the organizations themselves. And in 5 years from now, if that particular person is not there doing the same thing anymore, and in culture it does happen because it has high turnover, what is important is that the two organizations have previously collaborated, which means that, reigniting a particular collaboration is still easier than if they didn't, for example. So yeah, you increase the validity of the answer by having a good think about the concepts, to do the conceptual work around your project, to understand the objectives of the project. Perhaps there's no perfect answer, but I think a mixed methods approach is definitely a better approach than if you just do one single thing. in order to claim that you get, the most out of that particular understanding. Thank you. All right. Okay, so we are 9 people. I'm not sure if it will be too interesting to do the exercise with 9 people. I think it works more for more people, but if you're curious about what I had in mind, please do leave me a comment here so that I know I can explain. All right. I guess we can also stop the recording now.